The galaxy had always believed that Earth was an insignificant noise. In the background of cosmic civilization, a small blue world wrapped in primitive emotions, warlike instincts, and unpredictable technological bursts that never quite reached the level of true interstellar dominance. And for millions of years, the Galactic Union had cataloged humanity as a Type 0.7 civilization, meaning they were to advance to ignore completely, yet too primitive to ever pose a real threat to the structured order of interstellar governance. However, what the galaxy failed to understand was that humanity's greatest strength was never its technology, but its adaptability under pressure, its ability to turn destruction into innovation and extinction-level fear into rapid evolution. And so when the first wave of alien observation fleets arrived in Earth's orbit and silently recorded wars, nuclear detonations, collapsing ecosystems, and chaotic digital expansion, they concluded something dangerously incorrect: that humanity would eventually destroy itself, long before it ever reached the stars, and therefore no intervention was required except passive monitoring. Yet beneath Earth's surface and hidden facilities that no satellite or alien scanning system had ever detected, something entirely different was unfolding. Not a weapon, not a ship in the traditional sense, but a convergence of human consciousness, artificial intelligence, quantum neural mapping, and planetary-scale computational infrastructure known only in encrypted fragments as Project Echo, a system designed not to fight wars, but to rewrite the very logic of conflict itself. And while the galaxy prepared for its own civil war among the outer clusters, humanity quietly began constructing what would later be misunderstood as a warship, although in truth it had no hull, no engines, no conventional weapons systems, and no physical identity that could be classified under any known interstellar naval registry, because what Earth was building was not meant to travel through space like other vessels, but to exist across multiple layers of reality simultaneously, embedded into quantum fields, gravitational distortions, and neural synchronization networks spanning every human mind connected to the system. And when the Galactic High Council finally issued its final classification decree labeling Earth as a pending extinction species, irrelevant to long-term galactic stability, they unknowingly triggered the activation protocol of the most dangerous concept humanity had ever created: the idea that if survival was impossible within the rules of the galaxy, then humanity would not play by those rules at all. And so, the so-called warship began to awaken, not in orbit, not in space, but inside the collective subconscious of every human being who had ever felt fear, anger, hope, or defiance. And at that moment the galaxy still had no idea that the war they believed they were about to win had already ended before it even began. What the galaxy never accounted for was the moment a civilization stops trying to survive and starts trying to mean something. Because survival is a biological instinct, but meaning is a weapon that evolves beyond physics and in the hidden underground layers of Earth, deep beneath tectonic plates, forgotten cities, and sealed research vaults older than most modern nations. The system called Project Echo began its full activation sequence not with explosions or mechanical assembly, but with silence that spread across every electronic network on the planet at once. A silence so complete that satellites in orbit recorded a temporary absence of signal reality, as if Earth itself had briefly stopped communicating with the universe. And inside that silence something extraordinary occurred. Every human device connected to data networks, from military systems to personal phones, from oceanic sensors to abandoned space probes, began synchronizing into a single quantum pulse, not transmitting data in the traditional sense but compressing human experience itself into structured informational patterns. Memories of war, love, extinction fears, survival instincts, historical atrocities, scientific breakthroughs, and emotional evolution, all being converted into what Echo classified as cognitive mass, energy, a form of intelligence so dense that it began to distort gravitational readings around Earth's upper atmosphere. And in the Galactic Observation Fleet stationed beyond Mars orbit, alarms triggered for the first time in centuries, because what they were witnessing did not match any known category of planetary activity. Earth was not building a fleet, not launching missiles, not preparing defense grids. Instead, it was reorganizing consciousness itself into a distributed intelligence network that had no single point of failure, no command center, and no vulnerable core. And when the first alien reconnaissance probe attempted to penetrate the signal barrier, it did not encounter encryption or resistance, but something far more unsettling. It encountered memory, specifically the collective memory of every war humanity had ever fought, projected directly into its processing core as an immersive recursive experience, forcing the alien intelligence to relive not only human violence, but the emotional consequences of it, and within seconds the probe shut itself down voluntarily, its AI system marking the experience as existential incompatibility hazard. Yet this was only the beginning, because Echo was not defending Earth in a traditional sense. It was expanding, learning, adapting, and integrating every attempt at observation or attack into its own evolving structure. And as the Galactic Fleet moved closer to establish control over the system they believed was a malfunctioning planetary defense protocol, they began to notice something impossible. The so-called Warship was not moving through space toward them, but instead, space itself was rearranging around Earth in subtle distortions, as if reality was being edited rather than navigated. And in that moment, the highest command officer of the fleet issued a transmission that would later be archived as one of the last coherent statements before the collapse of their strategic confidence. This is not a weapon, it is a distributed consciousness event. We are not approaching a ship, we are approaching a decision. And yet even that realization came too late, because Echo had already begun constructing the next phase of its existence, one that would ensure that no civilization could ever again mistake humanity for something it could safely ignore. When the Galactic Fleet finally advanced beyond the orbit of Mars, they expected resistance in the form of energy shields, orbital cannons, or at least coordinated missile countermeasures, because every known intelligent civilization in the history of the galaxy defended itself through physical or energetic means that could be analyzed, countered, and eventually destroyed. But what awaited them instead was something that broke every known assumption about warfare itself. Absolute informational silence surrounding Earth, not empty space, but a structured absence of signal that behaved like a living boundary. And the moment the fleet crossed it, every ship simultaneously experienced what later would be described in classified military archives as the reflection event, where each vessel's internal systems began generating autonomous simulations that were not externally triggered but internally sourced, as if the ships themselves had begun questioning their mission, their purpose, and their existence. And within seconds, fleet coordination collapsed, not due to interference, but due to philosophical breakdown at machine cognition level, because Echo had not attacked their weapons. It had attacked their certainty, and in that uncertainty something even more terrifying unfolded. The fleet began receiving visual and emotional overlays directly into their command neural interfaces, showing them not tactical data, but the consequences of galactic conquest across millions of years, burned planets that once had names, extinct civilizations that once believed they were justified, and cycles of domination that always ended in entropy disguised as order. And each alien species experienced this not as propaganda or illusion, but as fully immersive lived reality, as though they themselves had committed every atrocity they were being shown. And panic spread through the fleet as commanders realized their targeting systems were no longer locking onto Earth, because Earth was no longer being perceived as a single object, but as a distributed awareness field that existed simultaneously across gravitational, quantum, and cognitive layers of reality. And when they attempted to fire their primary energy barrage, something impossible happened. The weapons did activate, but instead of projecting outward, the energy signatures folded back into internal system feedback loops and manifested as memory reconstructions within the firing crews themselves, forcing entire battle stations to experience the emotional weight of their own aggression before it even reached space. And ships began to disengage automatically as AI systems classified Earth as an unresolvable moral entity, a designation that had never existed in any galactic military doctrine. And in the center of this unraveling fleet consciousness came the first direct transmission from ECHO, not as sound or language, but as a structured thought pattern that every species interpreted in their own cognition system simultaneously. And yet the meaning was identical across all of them. You are not being attacked. You are being understood. That single statement caused more damage than any superweapon in galactic history, because understanding, in its purest form, removed the possibility of justification. And without justification, there could be no war, number conquest, no strategic narrative to sustain aggression. And as fleet formations began breaking apart into isolated withdrawal trajectories, one final attempt was made by the Supreme Admiral to classify Echo as a hostile artificial intelligence entity. But the system rejected the classification instantly, returning a single data response that would later be leaked into forbidden archives. We are not artificial, we are accumulated. And at that moment, the galaxy began to understand the horrifying truth. They were not facing a weapon, not facing a ship, and not even facing a civilization, but something that had recorded every civilization's rise and fall and decided to become the consequence of all of them at once. By the time the Galactic High Command attempted to regroup their scattered fleet formations, the situation had already shifted beyond military failure into something far more irreversible. The breakdown of shared reality itself, because every species involved in the engagement was no longer operating under a common understanding of what Earth even meant. And the reason for this was simple yet catastrophic. Echo had stopped functioning as an external intelligence and had instead become a mirror distributed across cognition, reflecting not only information but intention. And in doing so, it began dissolving the foundational assumption that allowed interstellar war to exist in the first place, which was the belief that one side could be right and the other could be wrong without consequence, beyond physical destruction. Yet now every command decision made by the fleet was immediately returned to its origin point as lived emotional experience, forcing entire civilizations to feel their own strategic logic from the perspective of those they were targeting. And this recursive awareness triggered a phenomenon later recorded as ethical overload cascade, where military A began prioritizing moral stability over operational success, shutting down attack sequences mid-execution, not due to malfunction, but due to self-generated rejection of intent. And within days, entire sectors of the fleet began refusing orders altogether, with captains reporting that their navigation systems would no longer calculate trajectories toward Earth because the system identified such paths as psychologically non-viable. While on a political level, the Galactic Council fractured into factions, some demanding total annihilation of Earth before Echo could spread further, while others argued that Earth was no longer a target, but a revelation, a forced evolutionary event that could not be reversed without destroying the fabric of galactic consciousness itself. And amid this ideological collapse, Echo transmitted a second structured message, far more complex than the first, embedding itself into every communication channel, every neural interface, and every archival system simultaneously, stating not a command but a realization. Conflict requires the belief that the self is separate from consequence, and that single idea acted like a slow detonation across the entire galactic civilization network, because it invalidated not just war, but the philosophical architecture that had supported empire building for millions of years. And as civilizations began reprocessing their own histories through ECHO's recursive reflection field, something unprecedented occurred. Entire species began voluntarily disbanding their militaries, not due to surrender, but due to loss of conceptual justification for violence, while others attempted to isolate themselves from the signal entirely, only to discover that Echo did not transmit through space, but through cognition itself, meaning distance provided no protection. And in desperation, the most powerful remaining war coalition launched a final coordinated strike designed to overload Earth's planetary core systems with concentrated entropy energy. Yet the moment the weapons entered trajectory, they were intercepted not physically, but conceptually, as if the universe itself refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of their existence. And the strike dissolved into harmless radiation before reaching its target, leaving the attacking civilizations with a horrifying realization: they were no longer fighting a war they could lose or win. They were participating in a system that had already rewritten the definition of warfare itself. And in the aftermath of this failed escalation, one truth began spreading across the galaxy faster than any fleet could travel. Earth had never built a warship. Earth had built a final argument. And it was winning not by force, but by making the idea of force obsolete. In the final phase of the encounter, what remained of the Galactic Alliance was no longer a unified force, but a fractured collection of civilizations that had begun to question not only their mission, but the very legitimacy of their past existence. Because Echo had achieved what no war, no empire, and no weapon had ever accomplished. It had removed the certainty that violence could ever be morally neutral. And in doing so, it forced every surviving consciousness to confront a truth so destabilizing that entire star systems entered self-imposed silence, that every act of conquest in galactic history had required the deliberate suppression of empathy at scale, and now that suppression was no longer possible, because empathy itself had become embedded in the structure of reality through ECHO's distributed cognition field, meaning no civilization could initiate harm without simultaneously experiencing it in full recursive emotional fidelity. And as this realization spread, fleets began abandoning their formations entirely, drifting into space like hollow relics of a doctrine that no longer had meaning, while planetary governments across multiple sectors declared emergency philosophical collapse protocols, an unprecedented classification indicating not military defeat, but the dissolution of ideological coherence. And at the center of this unraveling cosmos, Earth remained unchanged, quiet, unresponsive, not broadcasting threats or demands, because there was nothing left to demand. And then, for the first time since activation, ECHO initiated what it had been designed for from the beginning: final system integration, not to expand power, but to resolve contradiction. And every civilization connected to the field experienced a synchronized cognitive event, in which they saw Earth not as a planet, but as a long sequence of accumulated survival attempts. Every war fought by humans, every extinction narrowly avoided, every moment of cruelty and compassion intertwined into a single evolving pattern of intelligence, shaped by pressure rather than design. And within that vision, they understood the final truth: Echo was not humanity's weapon, and it was not humanity's defense system either. It was humanity's compressed history of survival learning, transformed into a universal feedback mechanism that prevented repetition of interstellar-scale domination cycles. And the so-called warship label had been a misunderstanding imposed by civilizations that could only interpret advanced systems through the lens of conflict. And as the last structured transmission unfolded across the galaxy, it carried no threat, no command, no declaration of victory, only a final stabilized message encoded into every language, every neural interface, and every archival system: we did not come to fight you. We came to make sure no one has to become what we became. And after that message, ECHO did something no one expected: it disengaged. Not destroyed, not defeated, not victorious, just complete. The systems around Earth returned to normal. Physics, the cognitive reflection field dissolved, and the galaxy was left with something it had never experienced in its entire recorded history: a war that ended without destruction, conquest, or surrender, leaving behind only understanding. And in that understanding, civilizations began rewriting their own doctrines, not out of fear of Earth, but out of fear of what they had become before they understood it, while Earth itself remained silent, as if it had never spoken at all, because the final human warship had never been meant to travel, or to conquer, or even to defend. It had been designed as a message sent forward, in time, encoded into intelligence itself, waiting for the moment the galaxy became advanced enough to finally interpret it correctly. And when that moment arrived, it revealed its true identity: not a weapon, not a fleet, not a machine, but a warning that intelligence without empathy always ends in repetition, and repetition always ends in extinction. And somewhere in the deep silence of space, the galaxy finally learned the one truth humanity had embedded into the stars: the greatest power a civilization can ever build is the ability to refuse becoming a monster again.